Folks, this is for Carolyn Jackson and myself. This is our first time, at least my first time, using this room for an event like this. And we knew we needed more community space when we built a new fire station. It really is quite a magnificent room, isn't it? Yeah, really a special place. So really pleased, and such a great crowd. You know, there were a couple of years. We've been doing this since 2012. When they started doing it at the Holocaust Museum, as I recall, in Washington, D.C. And then we continued on year after year, unlike a lot of other cities who stopped doing this, Days of Remembrance. And why they stopped doing it, I don't know, but it kind of got built into our DNA as a city and our being. And that 1 year we missed, or 2 years, maybe Jim Nelson remembers we've missed one or two, it just doesn't feel right. Jim Nelson was a guy who was on our Human Rights and Relations Commission, was chair of it for a while when we were doing this work, and I see one of the other past chairs there too, one of the other members. So we, at our last city council meeting, we did a resolution, actually a proclamation on Days of Remembrance. I'm going to read that in a minute. But I noticed in typical city fashion, we've got good food and bad food out there. We got bananas, good food and fruit, and then there's potato chips. So pick your pathway if you feel like you need a little nutrition of one type or another. And I think about this Days of Remembrance, and it really asks something kind of difficult of all of us, and that is not just to remember, but to understand what remembrance requires. The Holocaust was not only an explosion of hatred, but it was also the slow erosion of responsibility. And we're kind of seeing that in modern times and modern days, and we're living through it. It showed how ordinary systems, ordinary language, and ordinary people can be drawn into something extraordinary and really horrific. When we think of the Holocaust, we often focus on its scale, millions of lives lost, but it is a deeper warning that lies at the bottom of it all. It says there's things that are possible to be done. So Days of Remembrance is not just about honoring victims. They are about confronting ourselves. We are asked to consider, at what point do we speak? At what point do we act? And what does silence cost? So as we go forward and listen to this wonderful presentation this evening, we're going to maybe have a little time for some questions and answers and some conversation afterwards. I'm going to read this proclamation, though, but I want you to be thinking about the things that we're going to hear and how it relates to our lives at the present time. So here's the proclamation we passed regarding Days of Remembrance, April 13th through the 20th, 2026. We passed this at our last city council meeting. Whereas the Holocaust was the state-sponsored systemic persecution and annihilation of European Jewry by Nazi Germany and its collaborators between 1933 and 1945. And whereas an estimated 6 million Jewish people, along with millions of Romani, disabled, LGBTQ+, and political dissidents, among other marginalized groups, suffered grievously and were murdered under Nazi tyranny. And whereas the history of the Holocaust offers an opportunity to reflect on the moral responsibilities of individuals, societies, and governments, and whereas in 1979, the United States Congress established Days of Remembrance of the victims of the Holocaust to coincide with the dates of liberation by American troops of the Dachau concentration camp. And whereas the Days of Remembrance have been set aside as a time for all of us to remember the victims of the Holocaust, as well as to reflect on the need for respect of all people, to strive to overcome intolerance and indifference through learning and remembrance. And whereas the community of Edina is dedicated to the principles of individual freedom and a just society, and whereas the Edina community honors the memory of the victims, survivors, descendants, rescuers, and liberators of the Holocaust, and whereas the people of the city of Edina remember the terrible events of the Holocaust, including the deaths of more than 1 million children, and remain vigilant against hatred, persecution, and tyranny. And now, therefore, the City Council hereby proclaims the week of April 13th to the 20th, 2026, including the Day of Remembrance known as Yom HaShoah, as Days of Remembrance in the City of Edina, and calls upon the people of Edina to join their neighbors in recognizing this week, and are invited to a Days of Remembrance event, which we're holding this evening, obviously, titled The Cello Still Sings, Courage and Conscience, One Conversation at a Time by author and speaker Janet Horvath, to be held Tuesday, April 14th, 2026 at the Fire Station number 2. So So that is the proclamation that was passed by the City Council. We're going to have Ian Nemiroff, who has been one of our residents who reinvigorated us on this Days of Remembrance. I'm going to have him come up and speak a bit. And then Carolyn Jackson from our City Council, my colleague, is going to introduce our speaker this evening. And it's going to be a fascinating evening for all of us on a beautiful sort of spring day in Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Hovland, and thank you for everyone who has come. Thank you to everyone who has come here tonight. I wish to start my remarks by thanking you, the City Council and City Management, for your longtime commitment to hosting forums about days of remembrance of the victims of the Holocaust and other days of significance to members of our community. It is an honorable and appreciated commitment. Days of remembrance are particularly important to me because my dad, a veteran of Omaha Beach and a liberator of the Dachau concentration camp, spent decades speaking about the Holocaust and teaching tolerance in schools throughout Arizona. According to his bio, when he was inducted into the Arizona Veterans Hall of Fame, he reached more than 100,000 students. When he died 11 years ago, congressional representatives, teachers, veterans, active duty soldiers, Holocaust survivors, Jewish and Christian religious leaders, and museum leaders who created Holocaust-related exhibits with him all told me how grateful they were for the impact he made in their community. Now I'd like to give a few brief remarks about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Before I do, I wish to be clear that my remarks are my own personal thoughts and not necessarily the thoughts of any community or organization. A few years ago, I had the good fortune, I was introduced by a friend of mine in the audience tonight, to become friends with a World War II veteran from southwestern Minnesota who served under General Patton for the entirety of Patton's campaign through Europe. While serving, Corporal Bergstaller took many photos of his experience about things as varied as signs posted by the American Army, the pole that was in the front of his Jeep so that they wouldn't get decapitated by piano wires stretched across the road, and wall hooks the Nazis used to hang human carcasses in the Buchenwald concentration camp they liberated. He was, of course, shocked by what he saw. And when he returned to his farm in southwestern Minnesota, he wanted to tell his family, including his parents and his uncle, about what he experienced. His uncle, to Corporal Bergstaller's further shock, said, "I don't believe you. Good Germans would never do something like that." Well, they did, and exploring what they did and why they did it are purposes behind the Days of Remembrance. Some of the facts are well known, such as that approximately 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis between 1941 and 1945. Some facts are somewhat less known, such as the fact that the Nazis also killed at least 6 million more non-Jewish people, including Poles, Serbs, Soviet prisoners of war, Romani, people with disabilities, political opponents, people who were considered homosexual or transgender, and black people living in Germany. These war crimes are every bit as terrible as the genocide against the Jews of Europe. But as stated by the Center for Holocaust Studies at University College London, they believe there was one difference, which is that the Holocaust was intended to exterminate the Jewish people. In addition to that, those well-known and somewhat well-known facts is a less discussed fact that between 5.3 and 7.5 million German and Austrian soldiers also died in the conflict, which could be more than 5% of their total populations. Most of them died after the Germans lost the Battle of Stalingrad, and at which time it became apparent to the German leadership that they would lose the war. And they kept them fighting so they could keep on with their program of extermination. And there was a little bit of looting going on there too, if you've really read the book Monuments Men. It is likely that many of the dead German soldiers are motivated as much or more by patriotism and loyalty than by anti-Semitism, although the anti-Semitic propaganda that motivated the population of those countries, including the soldiers, was a classic example of what British Rabbi Jonathan Sacks calls pathological dualism. According to Rabbi Sacks, pathological dualism does three things. It makes you dehumanize and demonize your enemies. It leads you to see yourself as a victim, and it allows you to commit what Rabbi Sacks calls altruistic evil. Altruistic evil is a virus that attacks the moral sense. Dehumanization destroys empathy and sympathy. It shuts down the emotions that prevent us from doing moral harm. Victimhood deflects moral responsibility. Altruistic evil recruits good people to a bad cause. It turns ordinary human beings into murderers in the name of high ideals. One lesson of the Holocaust is how this kind of rhetoric, dividing the world into my side, the good people, and the other side, the evil people, can lead to horrible actions. As Rabbi Sacks said in 2015, this mode of thinking leads to some of the worst crimes in history because it causes people to demonize their opponents, see themselves as victims, and convince themselves that evil committed in a good or sacred cause is justifiable, even noble. If there are internal resistances to such murderous and suicidal simplifications, they can be overcome by the invention of the scapegoat. Paranoia will do the rest. This is the politics of hate, and large parts of the world in the 21st century are awash with it. As noted survivor Elie Wiesel said, to forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. One of the lessons the world learned from the Holocaust was the dangers of anti-Semitism, not just to Jews, but to people everywhere. However, according to FBI tracking statistics of hate crimes in America, over the last 5 years, the second largest category is anti-Jewish hate crime incidents, with 7,828, which is more than the combined number of hate crimes against all other religious groups, despite Jews comprising 2% of the population. Globally, just in the week that ended March 14th, there were attacks on synagogues in Toronto, Ontario, Liège, Belgium, West Bloomfield, Michigan, Trondheim, Norway, and Rotterdam, Netherlands. Surveys show a rapid increase in anti-Semitic beliefs, particularly among younger people. I'm grateful that Janet Horvath will be our keynote speaker tonight. I look forward to hearing her Holocaust survivor father's story of music and how he transmitted his love of music to her as a second-generation survivor. In connection with her experience, I wish to share one final story from a 93-year-old friend of mine who actually couldn't be here tonight. He performed with the Minnesota Orchestra for 42 years, including, I think, maybe a couple decades with Ms. Horvath. As I said, he's 93. He couldn't be here tonight because he has rehearsal for a performance somewhere else. In 1957, he toured Europe with the U.S. Army Orchestra. He told me the German people were their most appreciative audience. I asked him, why the Germans? Why not the French or some other country? They all like music. He plays wonderful classical music. His response was that the Germans were the best audience, the most appreciative audience, because 12 years after the end of World War II, that was the first time they had heard music. People in Germany had heard music like that. I asked him why that was so. He said that was because they had killed many of their musicians. And the U.S. Army Orchestra allowed them once again to hear good orchestral music after more than a dozen years without. It was a personal example of how hating others will damage your own life. And with that, I wish to welcome Council Member Carolyn Jackson to welcome Ms. Horvath. Thank you all for coming.
Good evening. Thank you, Ian, for putting this event together and for the lovely history. I think we really have been missing this event, and it's lovely to see you all here tonight. So Janet's just one of my favorite people. Our kids both took lessons, piano lessons, with Winann Rossi, who is a local composer. And Winann believes that music is a communal event. So playing piano can be very lonely. You know, you don't really play with an orchestra and you don't have an ensemble. So she would have 1 in every 4 lessons be a group lesson. And so Harris and Judy were in the same group together and got to be good friends and played duets and had a great time and grew up musically together. So I was at a party, and Winann was having a chili party, and I said, Janet, what are you up to? She said, well, I just uncovered the most interesting story from my father, and I'm going to write a book about it. And that was quite a while ago, because she is now, this will be her 95th presentation of this book. And I'm thrilled. I bought one. I'm looking forward to reading it and having the story. But a little bit about Janet is she was a cellist with the Minnesota Orchestra from 1980 to 2012. She wasn't just a cellist, she was the associate principal cello. And so real important musical talent here in Minnesota and just a shining star. The book has received wonderful reviews. It was named one of the 100 best independently published books in 2023 by Kirkus Reviews. And she's musically talented, writing talented, and with no further ado, I invite Janet Horvath. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, and I'm so pleased to see so many people. Thank you for coming here, and thank you, Mayor and Thomas, Ian, and Carolyn for inviting me to share my story and to hopefully hold a very courageous conversation afterwards. Most of you will know me, maybe, as a professional musician. Some of you may have seen me play. So we have to start with music. So this is a beautiful piece by Debussy. I think it'll set the tone beautifully. The art that you see is by a local Stillwater impressionistic artist. Her name is Cami Mendlick, and they blend beautifully. Thank you. I come by it honestly. As you'll see, so my father, George, and my mother, Catherine Horvath, were professional musicians and coming from Budapest, Hungary, and they were Holocaust survivors. Who would think that this elegant couple had suffered with deprivation, starvation, and terror? Beneath the veneer, our family was haunted by an eerie hush that surrounded their experiences, and music was our lifeline. I always like to start with just reading the flap of the book because I think it gives you a sense of what it was like growing up with that. The cello sound before conscious memory permeated my very being, its lush golden tones the closest sound to the human voice. My earliest memories are of lying on the floor next to my father as he practiced the cello, the metronome marking the music's pulse. My parents never considered that my petite stature and tiny hands were not ideal for playing the cello or carrying the bulky beast in and out of vehicles and up staircases. Nonetheless, engulfing the instrument with my body in an embrace, I endeavored to produce the seductive sounds my father coaxed out of his cello. They remained devoted to making this a more beautiful world through music, but their past remained shrouded in silence. Over the years, I grew obsessed with the Holocaust, reading everything I could on the subject. I tried to imagine, then I tried not to imagine, what my parents might have gone through. My core harbored the unspeakable, at times crushed by the repulsive burden. Breaking free was futile. I had been genetically stamped. In order to make sense of my parents, my upbringing, and ultimately my own baffling anxieties, I resolved to pursue truths about the past. As that generation passes away, and there are just very few actual survivors left now, many of us, we call ourselves G2, Generation 2, we're obsessed about researching the secrets of the past, trying to learn our histories, determined to leave a lasting legacy for the future. But digging into the past seemed impossible. My parents never spoke about it, but we didn't need the words to hear the tune which oozed into our genes. And somehow, as children, we gleaned we had to succeed in ways they couldn't and to live for those who didn't. So what could I do? I was busy with my career. I was busy with my own family. My parents were still in Toronto, and I was here. So I would rush back and forth between here and Toronto, and being the absent daughter, trying to do everything in 2 weeks or a week that I had with, shopping and making meals and taking them to the doctor. So maybe I was afraid to ask the questions. Maybe I was afraid to hear the answers. But in the last year of my father's life, he revealed a deeply hidden secret which unleashed the whole history. So I was driving my father to yet another doctor appointment, this time the neurologist, on a yucky, slushy January day. You remember what those are like, right? So I managed to get him down the stairs, get him in the car so he didn't bump his head, load the walker, and then I sat into the car to drive, and I'm gripping the steering wheel, and I'm thinking, okay, what should we talk about? Because my father wasn't too good at small talk. He could be difficult sometimes. And so I realized that my father, he played with the Toronto Symphony for 38 years, but before the war was in the Budapest Symphony. As a very young man, he'd played with some of the most famous maestros in Europe. But I'd never asked him if he ever played with one of my personal idols. So here he is in his prime, playing with the Toronto Symphony. So I looked at him, I'm gripping the steering wheel and I'm driving and I'm saying, Dad, did you ever play with Leonard Bernstein? And suddenly he put his hand to his cheek. His eyes seemed to roll into the back of his head. And I thought, oh, yikes, what should I do? Pull over? I mean, I didn't know what was going on. And then suddenly he sat erect and his eyes were blazing and he said, yes, it was a very hot day. It was in the Jewish orchestra in the DP, Displaced Persons Camps. And you know what? He was just a kid. And he came and he played Rhapsody in Blue. And I talked to him and I said, I want to go to America. And then it was, I don't know if he caught himself, he leaned against the side of the car and then shook his head gravely and he wouldn't talk anymore, or he didn't remember anymore. Even before I could even get my, is this so weird? Oh, sorry. Get my tongue around the questions I had in my, my mind. Well, what were you doing in Germany? Because he told me it was in Germany. And was my mother with you? And how did you get a cello to play? Well, how did you get the strength to play? But he wouldn't talk anymore. So I got him to the doctor, I got him home, tucked him in that night, and I raced to Google, thankfully for computers. My father had remembered all the music on the program. He always remembered the music. And he told me that there had been a singer on that program, who's had to sing in the concentration camps for the Nazi guards at age 15. Her name was Henia Dermashkin-Gurko. I thought, well, how many of those could there be? Hopefully, I would stumble on something, and I did. There had been a signed printed program, and I couldn't believe it. Thought, wow, from 1948, a signed program had been donated to the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City. And I wrote them immediately. I said, my father played in this orchestra, and, do you have the program? She says, writes me right back, the archivist, and says, yes, Janet, next time you're in New York City, please make an appointment. We'd be happy to show you the program that's in our archives, but don't you want to see the live video testimony and the photographs? Yeah, that's what I said. Oh my gosh. So I started screaming it to my husband, and fortunately that year, which was 2009, there was a run out, we call it, from the Minnesota Orchestra. We went to play in Carnegie Hall. And run outs are pretty hectic. You fly out, you go to sleep, you wake up, you play the concert, and then you leave. You're lucky if you can cram in some dinner. And but there was a window of opportunity in the morning, so I got up really early, raced down to Battery Park. The archivist met me at the door, when they opened, donned white gloves all the way to her elbows, reached into these tiny black archival boxes, and pulled out 4 little teeny tiny photos, and there was my father standing next to Leonard Bernstein. So I couldn't believe it, and she had a photocopy that she could draw the name, and George Horvath, Toronto, Canada, and everything, identifying him. And then she showed me the program. So here's an example of the replica. You can see that it's pretty aged and wrinkly. And I did look at it and think, oh, I'm gonna have to get somebody German to translate this. I knew all the musical numbers on it. And then I realized, well, of course it's not German, it's Yiddish. Because how else would 5,000 displaced persons who were at this Landsberg displaced persons camp in the Bavarian zone, which perhaps you know, that when the Allies were confronted with what are they going to do, how are they going to put infrastructure back together, they divided the countries into the Allied groups. So Bavaria was under the American army. And so here is the program, and you can see that, I don't know if you can see, Dermashkin, she's singing, concert singer. And then this is the photo that I saw. So my father's 1, 2, 6 from your left, and peeking out from the second row. So while I was there, the archivist set me up in a little cubicle and put a VHS or Beta Hi-Fi. You remember those things, VHS tape? Put that in a machine and left me to listen to Henia Dermashkin-Gurko sing yearning melodies, Yiddish songs of, yearning for home. And I was literally transported. But little did I know that the archivist went to the telephone and she called a woman and said, "Hey, Rita, there's some lady here all the way from Minneapolis, and I don't know why, but she's watching your mother's video, and maybe you should call her." So I finished the tape and raced to Carnegie Hall for the rehearsal. And amongst the cacophony of everybody warming up, I get a phone call from Rita Lerner, who is a woman my age, whose mother was Henia Dermashkin-Gurko, the singer, and whose cousins' parents were both in this orchestra. And so they all, were together. And it was as if I'd just met a sister because we had this amazing common experience. So she told me that her cousin, had collected other documents and photographs. And this is the photo that she sent me very soon after. So my father is in the last row with the mustache, holding the cello, standing in the middle. So I was able to procure a copy of this photograph that you just saw, and I blew it up to poster size, and I rolled it up, and I was ready to bring it to Toronto to show my father, hoping that I wouldn't bring him further pain, hoping that he would be able to remember some people and be willing to. Maybe he would be angry at me for bringing it up. I didn't know. So typically, he would meet me. He was on the 14th floor. He'd meet me all dressed up, looking debonair, and cover my face in noisy smooches at the elevator, which he did. And I was practically dropping this poster. He says, "What you have there in that thing?" He had a very strong Hungarian accent. He says, "Show me already, show me." So I unfurled it and put it across the dining room table, and I literally was holding my breath. Oops, I thought the next picture was, there he is. Holding my breath as he looked down, and I thought, okay, does he remember? Is he going to say anything? And there he is, and he points to somebody there and says, here is David Arbin. His name was Chaim Arbeitman. He changed it to David Arbin. He got into the Philadelphia Orchestra as if it had been his own accomplishment. And he said, "I sat with him all the time on the bus." I said, "What do you mean all the time?" And that's this picture. There's my father in the scarf and the mustache. So it turns out that he didn't play 2 concerts. He played 2 with Leonard Bernstein. But this 17-member group was bussed all over Bavaria. My father played 200 concerts, bringing morale-boosting programs to those still languishing in the displaced persons camps, people that were hoping for news of loved ones and waiting for the right paperwork to leave Europe. So this group looks like any young people's group going on some fun excursion, right? So they played, they were sponsored by the Joint Distribution Committee and UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Organization, and in return they were paid in canned American goods, food and coffee and oil and sugar, the things that were in very short supply at that time. So this concert, we know that the music was transformative, penetrating through the shroud of darkness, transporting those languishing in the camps, filling them with a belief that there might still be beauty in the world and there might be hope for a better life. But for those musicians and my father, but to make music again and to bring solace to others was a blessing, and attendees never forgot the experience. So when I got home after this one, this concert, this trip, I came back here to my life, my career, my husband and son, and then I got a phone call that, your daddy, Lolo George, he's scribbling late at night, and I don't know why. Maybe you should ask him and, call him or next time you come. And so I was waiting to get a documentary that Sonia Becker, so Rita Lerner and Sonia Becker's parents were both in this orchestra, and they had taken care of getting a documentary made. Had it been known that my father was still with us, he would have been in the film, but as it is, he's in it in still pictures. And I waited to see this documentary the next time I went to Toronto. I guess I was afraid to watch it myself, but I wanted to watch it with my father. And we held hands, and suddenly a picture like this one came up, and he said, "Janet Kane, it's me. I had so much hair." And I know that he had a disconnect between seeing his adult daughter and seeing himself as a young man in those tragic times. So I was able to urge him to tell me what he was writing about. And he pulled out this paper with dark scrawl on it. He could hardly write at that point because he had Parkinson's. And he said, "Here I read my testimony to you what happened to me during the Holocaust." He said, "Oh, Dad, just a minute. You think I could get my computer?" I thought I'd, write it as he's saying it, because his handwriting was almost illegible. And I start with the computer, and I stopped him several times because the Hungarian words are like this long, and I said, "Dad, how do you spell that?" He said, "Why are you interrupting me every second?" And I thought, okay, I better not make him angry. And as it turns out, my Hungarian is not bad. My vocabulary is about a 10-year-old's vocabulary. So I didn't have the vocabulary for lynching poles, gravel pits, wheelbarrows. So I sounded them out and wrote them down and figured I'd look them up later. So what my father told me was the first time that I'd ever heard these details, and I was well into my 50s at that point. So some of you may know that the invasion of the Nazis to Hungary occurred very late in the war because the Hungarians were allies to Germany. And this was because after the First World War, at that point, the Austro-Hungarian Empire took up a lot of Europe. And after the First World War, Hungary was cut down to a landlocked small country, cutting off a lot of Hungarian speakers. So Hitler promised Hungary that they would regain some of their territory if they were allies. That's their excuse anyway. So the Nazis invaded Hungary March 19th, 1944, and Adolf Eichmann, the henchman who was in charge of the final solution, went personally to Budapest to see to this last large Jewish population in Europe. So by this point in 1944, many millions had already perished. So my father remembers that he was playing a Sunday afternoon performance when the Nazis marched in and fired everybody, stopped the concert. And then you will see that some of the, that's ahead of schedule too. Some of the restrictions that happened very, very quickly in Budapest. So people had to wear the star. They had to only shop at certain times when there were slim pickings. Christians were not allowed to shop in Jewish stores. So it became very critical. My mother used to say, I heard rumors. I'll show those Nazis, I'll show those Germans, I can work. And that's what they thought initially. And then rumors were spreading again, and my mother said, well, maybe they won't take away married women. And so the young girls got married en masse. So May 26th, 1944, so this is only 2 months later, my parents got married. My mother had to borrow a dress. She had to get permission from her family because she was only 17. They went to a justice of the peace with forged documents that said they were Protestant and were married. And then the next morning, they rounded up my father for slave labor in the copper mines of Bor, Yugoslavia. My father thought that was a death sentence, and of course it was for many thousands of Hungarian men. But his train was the last train that did not go to Auschwitz. My father described the brutal work to me in this testimony that he had to do as a slave laborer in the copper mines. And I would look at him and think, I can't believe that this could have happened to my own father. The Hungarian history is not that well known by most people. We know the German and Austrian history better. But between May 16th and July 6th of 1944, 437,402 Jews were deported in less than 8 weeks on 147 trains. 10 to 15% were selected for work. So this kind of thing on storefronts was very common. You've seen some of these pictures before. This next one is a very famous photo that's at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Sadly, the boy has never been identified, but the Nazi brandishing the rifle has been, and his name is prominently there in the archives. This is actually a Hungarian group being rounded up. So I think this is a good point to play a little more music, and this is a lullaby. So I think you could see all the Jewish stars in several different languages, just to show you that a Jew was a Jew and was singled out whatever country they came from. My mother was determined that she was a Hungarian, and Judaism was her religion. She was Hungarian and proud about it. And so were many German Jewish people, but they were not considered citizens. So when my father was liberated, he was liberated by Serbian partisans. Now, I wouldn't be standing here if this particular story had come true. So the Nazis could already hear the Russian soldiers coming towards that slave labor camp. And they decided to divide the men in two, and a big group would be marching home, and another group would stay behind. And my father was convinced that the people who had to be they would be shot, and that the people marching would indeed be marching home. He tried whatever he could to try to get into that other group, and fortunately he didn't, because the men who were marching home were starved. They dropped where they were marching in the freezing cold, and most perished. So when he was liberated, Serbian partisans opened the gates and they went running into the countryside. My father wandered through the forest in the winter without shoes or food, covered in lice, and trudged from Yugoslavia to the border of Hungary, some 286 miles, if you could walk in a straight line. Okay, so now, I've said this at least 95 times, and plus in the book. Do I understand that that was my father and that was his experience? No, it just doesn't sink in. My father was an artist, not an athlete. And yet somehow he was able to survive that. I think it was partly because he wanted to get home to his new bride, and he carried this photo in his pocket somehow. It would be weeks before he could get to Budapest, because there was a brutal siege of the city, which lasted 110 days, from December 26, 1944 to February 13, 1945. And Budapest was leveled. And I just can't even imagine how my mother could have survived. So this is a spoiler alert. I did get her story as well. And it's a great story how I did get it. But she, at one point, was rounded up, all the women were rounded up and forced to go to an arena. It was pouring rain, and the dogs were barking, and the guns were, the bullets were ricocheting, and the Nazis were screaming and bellowing. And my mother had an older brother who said, you go from line to line. He was pretty savvy. You check it out, see what they're doing, and come back and report to me. And so somehow she was able to do that. To the end of the day, the Nazis said, you come back tomorrow, or we'll bomb the whole neighborhood, And she was, frightened to death, but noticed that on one side, the pregnant, the elderly, the little tiny children went to the left, and the beautiful girls and the strong young people went to the right. And then my uncle said, this sounds terrible. It's better to die in freedom. You're not going back. And so somehow they hid. A la Anne Frank, my mother hid in bomb buildings under coal and lumber without food, not daring to breathe. And thankfully, she managed to survive. So I did want to read you this tale of my mother, because I wanted you to know that it's not only about my father, but it's about my mother too. It was a great cook and beautiful woman, and absolutely always looked ahead. She never, ever alluded to this past. So when I got this story, the testimony from my father, I thought, playing 200 concerts after the war for refugees, what a story. And what I didn't think, there's a lot of Holocaust books out there, and of course there are 6 million stories, but there wasn't as much about how they put their lives back together again after such trauma, and how they managed to come to a foreign country, foreign food, not having the language skills, everything's different, and how do they cope? And I thought that was a really worthy subject. But I've written another book. I've written a lot of other things about music, but I had no idea how I would put a book like this, of this scope, 70 years of history, together. So I decided to go back to school, went to Hamline University, got my MFA in creative writing, wanting to get the support from teachers and everything, how to put it together. And one of the thoughts was, you need to use some musical symbolism. So I decided to use a term from theater called entr'acte, which before they could just press a button and change the technology on a stage, they would have little mimes or dance or another type of entertainment in front of the curtain, and they would call it an entr'acte. And I use that term to catapult my readers back in time to my childhood, so that I could reflect on what I knew when I was a child. And so this is Esterhazy Tort, and it's entr'acte 1957. The photograph is yellowed. Risking more fissures, handling it gingerly, I gaze at the fragile document. A glimpse conjures my younger self and my elegant mom. The scene is tranquil. My face inclined lightly grazes Mama's right arm as she lights the candles. Not your typical American frosted cake. This tort is home-baked, ornately decorated, and Hungarian, of course, with a creamy chocolate buttercream sandwiched between layers of sponge cake, glazed with apricot jam, my father's favorite, and garnished with melted chocolate. There are pretty little puffs of whipped cream encircling each of the 5 birthday candles. It floats on the exquisite white lace tablecloth. I remember the navy blue dress my mother's wearing, the one with tiny white polka dots, a crisscross bodice, and deep V neckline, which accentuates her curvaceous figure. Mama's raven hair is swept up so we can see her pearlescent skin, the white beaded choker, and matching earrings. This for a 5th birthday gathering at home. My dress is all satin and tulle. A too wide collar drifts off my shoulders. My hair is cut short haphazardly with home scissors, and my arms awkwardly hang by my sides. We gaze intently at the candles, seemingly unaware of anything but each other. The delicate beauty of the photo belies my mother's resilience and the deeper meaning, which I am aware of now from my present-day perspective. What must it have meant to her to be able to celebrate with an Esterhazy tort, named after a 19th century prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire? In Canada, her new home, with her daughter, the daughter she might never have had, the daughter she hadn't dared envision just a few years ago, 17 and alone, desperate to survive, starving, emaciated, cowering in deserted tunnels and bombed buildings, barely daring to breathe, lest she be discovered by the Nazis. I scrutinize the photo, searching for clues. With pursed lips and suddenly clammy hands, I undress, slip on the navy blue polka dot dress, which still hangs in my closet, and wonder, how can she look so unscathed? How did she start anew, never looking back, never remembering, never alluding to those harrowing years? My mother's overprotectiveness makes sense now. I perceived a deep wound only my impeccable behavior could salve. As the living, breathing embodiment of survival, I tried not to cause them further pain, resolved to become what they couldn't be, attempted to make up for their losses, and fulfill their dreams. As the years passed, it became more and more difficult to live up to expectations. It was never enough. I had become an accomplished professional musician, married well, had a beautiful son, but I had left them by moving away. Life had become a perpetual farewell. So George and Catherine made the wrenching decision to start anew. They decided to leave Germany, and they had to have a council with the entire family, who decided to send the young people out, and they had to go to Munich. They knew they had to go to Germany, because if you wanted to leave Europe, you needed paperwork from Munich. And they had to be smuggled underneath hay in the back of a truck, a driver that they had bribed to make that journey, with the promise that they would immediately get jobs and try to earn enough money to bring the parents to also out. So my parents were able to get to Germany, and I had no idea about any of this. So after my father passed away, which was shortly after he gave me his testimony, I was able to go to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and work with an archivist. And so she sat down with microfilm. In those days we didn't have everything on the internet. And she says, Janet, the Germans, they were great with their record keeping when it was in Germany and Austria, but in Hungary it happened so fast, we're not going to find anything. I'm really sorry, but we'll look and we'll take our chances. And she starts going through this microfilm. And I said, stop, wait. I could find my father's signature. And there was this document that was a clue to when they got to Munich, which was August 15th, 1946. But it had 4 names. It had my mother's name, my father's name, my mother's brother, and my father's sister's name. So they went with them all together. And in fact, you had to go to the government offices in Munich to register. So this was that document. And I never would have known that, of course, their first choice was the United States, but they had a very strict Hungarian quota. It didn't matter if they were Jewish, they could be spies, So the United States was closed to Hungarians. Their second choice, which I didn't know, was South America. And perhaps a lot of Jewish people did go to South America, so did Nazis. And then their third choice was Canada. And I can imagine my mother saying, Canada, what's Canada? Where's Canada? And they heard that if you could fulfill certain professions, they would take you to Canada, into Canada. So my father wrote down that he was a farmer. My mother said she was a seamstress. My father got to the customs officers, in Halifax, and they said, these hands have never farmed a day in your life. And my father said, but I can learn. So they were able to get into Canada. So I began research at the Joint Distribution Committee headquarters in New York, and also the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I came across some more pictures. I couldn't believe it. Here is an action shot of Leonard Bernstein conducting. My father is in the very far left corner there, only 2 cellos. And here's an action picture. So they're obviously taking a bow. My father is standing to Bernstein's left, exactly where I have stood for 32 years in the Minnesota Orchestra, that close to the conductor. And here he is in those times, about 26 years old, looking very debonair. Here he is receiving flowers at the Feldafing concert. And I think we have to remark on the resemblance to, doesn't he look like Bradley Cooper? Yeah. So, yeah. So when I got to Hamlin also, the teachers made very strict rules. They said, first of all, you can't have 70 years of history. A memoir has to be 10 years, So I had to kind of figure out how to prove them wrong, that I could have a cohesive narrative for 70 years. And they also said, you authors, you go on too long. You have to end your book 100 pages before you think, maybe 200. And so that was a quandary. I didn't know not only how to end the book, I didn't know when to end the book. And I feel very fortunate that something landed in my lap. We say in Jewish, Yiddish, it was beshert, it was meant to be. That one day in 2017, I was in a noisy cafe having lunch, and I get a phone call. The digits, that many digits, I knew it had to be overseas. I go running out, and I hear a German lady on the phone, strong German accent, saying, "Oh, Janet, it's so fantastic. I finally found you. And you know what your parents went through is so terrible. And we have to teach the next generations, people like me, German non-Jewish people, we have to somehow teach the next generation. We're going to have a concert in May next year. Would you do us the honor to come to Landsberg next May?" I thought, well, I guess so. Sure, it might be nice in spring and in Germany in May. She says, and we want to replicate the program, with Leonard Bernstein exactly. Would you do us the honor to play Kol Nidre with the Landsberg School Orchestra? Now, that's when I started welling up. And I need to just give you a little background on what that piece means. So our most important holy days are in the fall. Rosh Hashanah is the new year, and Yom Kippur, we call it Yom Kippur, is the Day of Atonement. It's 10 days after the new year. During that time, we are asked by God, and we're supposed to not only ask forgiveness of God, that's only the smallest part of it. We're required to ask forgiveness of those we may have hurt, either intentionally or not, asking forgiveness of our neighbors, our friends, our children, our parents, our co-workers, and to not deny forgiveness to them if they ask forgiveness of us. So the Day of Atonement, we are examining our behavior of the previous year, hoping to do better in the next year. Kol Nidre is an ancient chant that opens that service the previous evening, and it sets the tone for the holy day. That chant is so beautiful, and it's ancient, that a German composer named Max Bruch, not Jewish, was so captivated by it that he ended up writing a beautiful piece for cello and piano, cello and orchestra, or cello and organ, called Kol Nidre. It's 12 minutes or so. And so I was asked to play this piece, which sets the tone for this very important holy day of the Jewish people. There isn't a Jew in the place that doesn't know that tune, I'll tell you. And what made it even more, thrilling was that my father played Kol Nidre in our synagogue growing up every year in Toronto for over 30 years. And I've played it here in the Twin Cities for another 30 some years until I retired a couple years ago. And so between us, we have more than 6 decades of history with this piece. Can I do it? I was really nervous about that in Germany, in the place where all these atrocities happened, could I play this piece? And could I convey the importance of this piece to the audience? Well, that was going to be the end of my book. They began advertising this event, and it was 70 years after the 1948 concert with Leonard Bernstein. And this was the poster that went out. Believe it or not, they were able to locate the original piano that Leonard Bernstein played on, and it was on display in the town hall with all kinds of information, placards about the orchestra members, including my dad. And there I am about to play it and telling the audience exactly what I just told you about the history of this piece. Now, I got to Landsberg a few days early to rehearse, and I found that the orchestra was young, really young, and they sounded like any junior high orchestra would sound. So I had to kind of whip them into shape and help them understand the meaning through the music and where to play louder, where to play softer and everything. And when it came to the concert, I have to say that we ascended to a different plane and played way better than we knew we could. And I know that those kids had an unforgettable experience, as did I and did the audience members. So here I am playing Kol Nidre. So here is an original photo of one of the musicians who played in this group with, actually this picture was prior to my father joining the group. They were still playing in concentration camp garb. And they played at the Nuremberg trials. They played all over the place. My father was still in slave labor in 1945, but he joined the orchestra in 1946. So I think I have a picture of, yes. We had no idea that they were going to wine and dine us and have a whole week of activities. So I played a concert that was 70 years to the day in the spot that my father played with Leonard Bernstein. 40 of us 2Gs, second generation people, descended upon Landsberg, those whose parents had been in the DP camp in Landsberg. There were 450 or some babies born at St. Attilian Benedictine Monastery, which is, Munich is here, Dachau is here, Landsberg is here, and St. Attilian is in between. And it's still a retreat center. They have a beautifully kept Jewish cemetery, and 450 some babies were born there. It became a haven for very ill survivors, some of whom still didn't make it. So they had a tour for us of the monastery, and we dedicated a plaque when we were there to acknowledge this history. And it was just, we were shaking our heads as to what kind of an experience this was. It was so reconciliatory, and we realized how we can bring people together through music, through collaboration, through these great dinners and events that we, were able to share with ordinary German folk. So I wanted to leave some time for questions, but I wanted to tell you that my intention was to lead readers through some of the difficult matter through a back door, through an alternate route. I was hoping that maybe through the cello, loving the cello, maybe loving Leonard Bernstein and wanting to know the story, or loving music, or knowing me, that they would pick up a book that they would not normally have picked up, a so-called Holocaust book. And I wanted to emphasize that I was shocked at Hamlin, that at the latter parts of my months there, we had a class that we traded manuscripts, and we critiqued each other, and that doesn't make any sense, or whatever. And I'm telling you that these, I was the oldest in the class. These students were there, 40-somethings who wanted a better degree, who wanted a better job. They were shocked at this material. Many of them didn't know this history. Many of them, their history didn't go beyond Afghanistan. They didn't even really know about Vietnam and that history. So I thought, this has got to be told over and over. And I'm so appreciative of you having this kind of a session, because it means so much that we have to keep teaching these stories to young people. So I wanted to tell you that I still have time, I think, that there's humor throughout. There are many threads, including my mother's fantastic cooking, and there's some recipes. There's also taking care of aging parents. There's me taking auditions and my first recitals and all this. So this is one of the funnier stories that I put in the book, just to attract people from different persuasions in life, So, November 16, my last visit with my father, although I didn't know that yet. Perhaps the previous night, I'd landed at the Toronto airport after hearing the news that my father's time might be at hand. He seemed asleep. I tiptoed to the kitchen to crack open a window, but a profusion of flowers impeded my access to the blinds. The orchid, its lavish blooms of iridescent purples, occupied most of the table. Perhaps my playing would soothe my father. Papa's torso listed leftward over the armrest and his head lolled back. I pulled the cello toward me, sat very close to him, and played the opening of the Bach Cello Suite No. 1, the prelude. With a steady oscillation of my bow, organ-like tones bloomed. The harmonies G and D echoed through the room. The triumphant climax imminent, I glanced up at my father. His stooped and salivating figure urged my fingers to sprint faster across the strings. As the last chord dissipated, my father suddenly sat erect, eyes blazing. Janet came. What fingering you use in bar 9, and why did you slow down so much in the middle? Play more in time, play it again. So I did. So, as a community, I think we're concerned about statelessness and displacement that continues today. And as a country, we are now confronted with issues that shake our very foundations. My mama's voice echoes in my mind. It can't happen here, And I cannot and must not put my head in the sand, as tempting as it sometimes is, as my parents' generation did. My hope was to create empathy for people that are going through a refugee situation, and to increase knowledge about the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, racism, but especially to inspire dialogue, one conversation at a time. I could never have predicted the explosion of divisiveness and hostility and the anti-Semitic rhetoric and racism that continues today. And I ask, how can we regain moral courage and clarity and to act with respect and kindness? Both Jews and Christians support compassion. And I think that through music, our family found a way for our hearts to speak and to bring people together. And perhaps the arts can inspire harmony. I'm going to just conclude with a very short last reading, and then would love to hear if you have any questions that I can answer. Consider a time when hell was on earth, when hands accustomed to a musician's bow, a writer's pen, a doctor's scalpel, a painter's brush, a tailor's needle, wielded shovelfuls of rocks, limestone, or human remains, when the air smelled of smoke, ashes, and grief, when the foundations of existence and the illusions that sustain us crumbled. My father, a young man confident of his future, wrenched from society, a celebrated artist turned slave laborer. The swollen and bloody knuckles, the back-breaking effort, the swirling musical phrases stilled. Depleted by the shame of helplessness, the shock of nakedness, the dread of men in uniform stomping by, he could never again tolerate being alone. A whiff of boiling cabbage or rusted copper or dripping blood triggered distress. In our family, trust was never regained. After the years of grief and imposed silence, my father's hands tingled to fill the stillness, and the hunger to create gnawed. His playing blossomed with a vitality, profundity, and spirituality I can only marvel at now. It must have been unnerving to learn how to feel again when survival entailed learning how not to feel. At least while he was playing, music imparted peace of mind. His cello wept. His music making stirred those who were equally scarred. A strange sensation would ripple in my throat when he played. The generous vibrato warmed the sound and conveyed a deeply moving story, expressed not in words or thoughts, but in emotions, illuminating a path to rebirth. I know now that beauty and inspiration ignites the best of the human spirit. The untenable pulsating, the tactile sensation of hugging the instruments and breathing the music as one creates a current that transforms us, elevates us, and propels us in ways we cannot explain. Thank you. So there's a question. We'll send the microphone around so you can be heard. And in case you do want a book, it's back there, and I'd be happy to sign them if you would like me to. So here's the question. Okay, doesn't work.
I talk louder.
It's for the video.
I'm sure.
Well, while they're fiddling, you talk loud and I'll repeat your question.
Did you have any siblings, and did any of the kids come over with your parents?
No, I was born in Toronto. My brother, I have a younger brother who's a doctor. Only a doctor would do for my mother. So we were both born in Toronto, and neither of us knew these stories. And the interesting thing people often ask me is, what did my brother think of me writing this book? And at first he said, Janet, it'll be nice for our family, but nobody's going to want to read this book, It's like, and he's eating his words now, of course. Yeah. Anyone else?
Did your parents have other friends or acquaintances that had similar backgrounds coming through a displaced persons camp? And what were their relationships with those people like?
So all of my parents' friends were Hungarian Jewish survivors. So we thought that was normal, And my mother, as I mentioned, never, ever spoke about it. So after she passed away, I asked her best friend, who had survived Auschwitz, if my mother talked to anybody, it would have been her. She also said my mother never, ever alluded to those times. Yeah. They were trying to protect us, and we were trying to protect them by being very well behaved. So, we find that some Holocaust survivors are willing to share with their grandchildren more than with their own children, if they, are still around. Yeah. Was there another one over here? The mayor wants to ask a question.
How long was your dad in that work camp, and how long did your mother have to hide out?
Well, we know that the Polish Jews had it really, really the worst, because that was the country that was first invaded. Because it was so late in the war, March 1944, it was a year, just a little over a year. My grandfather actually was, my grandfather was a decorated World War I hero. And he was he was certain that he wouldn't be rounded up because he was a hero. They wouldn't take me. But those were the first people that were taken as an example to others. So he was already in his 50s. And thankfully, he survived. He was sent to Buchenwald, which is one of the worst camps. And I have his letter of what he went through also. And it's amazing that he survived. He was emaciated. He was 60 pounds and, close to death, but he survived. Yes, back there.
I'll go quickly here. I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for your courage in sharing this story. It is so beautiful and inspiring and such an important reminder. And I'm married to a 2G as well. And so I can really appreciate the stories I've heard about my father-in-law. And one part of his experience was that he really lost faith in God and really struggled even with his Jewish faith until much later in his life. And I'm curious if that was the case for either of your parents as well.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So my parents did try to not be Jewish. They were convinced that it would happen again. And in fact, I was conditioned all my life to not say that I'm Jewish. And in fact, I have to admit that when the book first came out, people would say, "Oh, you've written another book. What's it about?" And I'd hesitate. I would always feel like, I don't know if I should say this, So this book has been cathartic for me to get over that conditioning that my parents did with me. I remember my mother even taught me a Hungarian Protestant prayer for bedtime. And I didn't even know that until recently. And I know that she thought that it would be important for me to know Christian prayers. So they did try to not be Jewish, but the Hungarians in Toronto, who were newcomers, were very anti-Semitic. And they just couldn't stand that. And especially when my brother was born, they were very determined that he would have a bar mitzvah and grow up in following the faith. So, yeah. There was another question over here.
Well, this isn't really a question, it's a comment. First of all, I'm not Jewish. Second, I think your story is just so tender and so beautiful and so intelligent on so many levels.
Thank you.
And when I was 12, I remember my mother telling me about the Holocaust and about the Germans. I was so horrified. And I'm like, I will never stay silent. That happens again. And then I'm 72 now, so it's been a long time, okay, since I was 12. It's 50 years ago, 60 years ago. And here we are. Here we are. And it's like happening again. And I'm like, what do I do? What do I say? I'm seeing the same thing happen right in front of my eyes. And it's horrifying. And it's really grievous. And I want to say to you and to all the Jews in this room, and I'm sure there are quite a few, in 2022, I went to Israel. It was the second time. The first time I was there, it was 30 years old. The country was, so it changed a lot. And I met a modern Orthodox artist in her store. And we became friends. We became really good friends. And when October 7th happened, oh my gosh, I've been in the bomb shelter with her as her children. They're running down there. I have learned about how the Jewish people, when somebody dies, guess what? It's not just their friends and family that go to the funerals.
Yeah.
It's the whole community. People that don't know you. Then they go to the house afterwards, one by one, and they give their condolences. And I've learned so much about beautiful things about the Jewish people since I met my friend whose parents emigrated, made Aliyah to Israel from Toronto. when I was at the kibbutz in 1980. It's crazy. I don't know, she's not great. She's not as old.
Thank you. Thank you for your
Anyway,
comment.
I just want to say that, I guess that's it.
Thank you. Was there another question over there? Well, if there are no more questions, thank you so much again for coming. And yeah, if you'd like to converse further, please, let's do that. And thank you again. Sorry. I'll just unplug these real quick. There. Thank you.
Folks, one more time before we adjourn, please help me thank our guests. So as we close this matter, just a reminder that, and Janet touched on this and others as well, that during the Holocaust, persecution did not begin with violence. It began with words, with laws, with the normalization of exclusion. Step by step, neighbors became strangers, and strangers became targets. By the time the world fully grasped what was happening, it was already too late for so many. Voices like Janet's remind us that history is not so distant. It lives on in memory, in family, and the responsibility to bear witness. The lives of loved ones like Janet's, like many of those in this room, were marked by unimaginable hardships, but also by resilience. The story she told today about her dad working his way back barefooted in the wintertime, 200 and some miles, back to his home country. Courage and the determination to endure. And to those here who are descendants of survivors, others, we acknowledge you with deep respect. The stories you carry are a gift and a trust. By sharing them, like Janet did with us, you ensure that remembrance does not fall into silence. And to all of us, this event, this moment, has something simple but profound. That remembrance is not only about the past, it is about what we choose to carry forward and how we choose to act. Survivors and their relatives like Janet Horvath have carried these memories forward not as history alone, but as a warning. Their stories remind us that dignity is fragile, that indifference can be as dangerous as hatred. In remembering them, we inherit a responsibility, not abstract, but immediate. Because remembrance, embraced, if taken seriously, changes how we live. It sharpens our awareness of injustice. It challenges us to resist the casual dismissal of others. It insists that we see people not as categories, but as human beings. So today we need to do more than just look back. We all need to make a quiet commitment looking forward. That we will notice, that we will question, that we will not let cruelty pass unchallenged. Not because we cannot do the past, because the future is still unwritten. Thank you all for being here this evening. It's a wonderful, wonderful evening. You were the star of the show. Thank you so much.